Hello guys, welcome to another video. And this one we're going to be taking a look at the recent Ascendancy data mines that have come out for the Legacy of Phrecia event, including all of the skill information, the skills that are actually granted by the Ascendancies. And we'll also be taking a look at a few changes that GGG have made to a few of the Ascendancies in the last few days. So beginning with the Polytheist there, which grants level 20 Abberath Fury. This is just triggered as soon as you take this skill and it's always on. And this is an ability that usually comes from the Abberath Fury unique boots. And these actually grant the level 7 version, so you can support that with obviously the support gems that go into the boots. This one you're not going to be able to support because it's an Ascendancy skill, but the actual skill itself is doing quite a bit more damage there. So the level 20 version is going to deal 150 to 225 fire damage, which is exactly triple the damage of the level 7 version. I actually expected this to be a bit higher. I thought it was going to be between 4 and 5 times the amount of damage of the level 7 version, but that's not the case. It's going to be exactly 3 times the damage. And notably, this does also have a 25% chance to ignite enemies instead of a base 10% chance, but the damage effectiveness is still the same at 100%. Now, regardless of this skill being a bit weaker than I expected, this is still going to be extremely strong as soon as you take this at around level 30 in the first lap. That's going to be extremely impactful. You're just going to be able to run through the campaign, and probably for the next 2 to 3 acts, you will feel really comfortable with this skill. And what I expect to happen is that most Templars are going to likely decide to take Polytheist as their first Ascendancy choice, and just take the Devout of Abberath there, to be able to get this level 20 Abberath Fury skill and just run through the campaign. And then they may decide to actually spec out of this Ascendancy as early as the 2nd or 3rd lab, so that they can then enter maps with their main build plan, which I think for most players is going to likely be the Puppeteer or the Architect of Chaos, and not the Polytheist in endgame. Next up, we have the Blind Prophet there, which grants level 30 Shade Form. It triggers that when you actually get hit whilst you have this formless node taken. And the Shade Form hasn't actually shown up on PoE1. It's still only showing the level 20 version. Now, it may be the case that this is the same skill with the same stats, but even then, it's usually the case that it actually shows the level in PoE1, and that's not the case here. So for now, all we can say is that it's likely the exact same skill with the same stats, in which case it would be a 3-second base duration with a 40-second cooldown. This effect actually makes you immune to physical damage, and it grants you a stealth buff there as well. But even if the level 30 version is actually a bit buffed, for example, it may have a lower cooldown time, or it may have a longer duration, or a bit of both, it will still be impossible to keep this effect up permanently, because this skill actually doesn't start cooling down until the effect finishes. Next up, we have the Servant of Arakaali, which has the level 20 Raise Spider skill, which is triggered when you make a kill with Brood Guard equipped there. And the Raise Spider skill has been data mined here. We can see level 1 to 20 there, but the actual stats of the skill itself are unchanged, which means that the base duration for spiders is still the same, and the buff that the spiders grant you is exactly the same as well. And you can have a maximum of 20 raised spiders, which means you can get up to 40% increased attack speed and 300% increased damage with poison, same as level 1 raised spiders there from the Arakaali's Fang unique. However, the spiders should deal a bit more damage there. We can actually see here the required level of 75 to 84. And if we actually head over to the page here for the actual summoned spider minion, we can see that at level 75, it deals an average of 997 damage. And if we were to change that to 84, we can see that the damage there is an average of 1,678, which is about 68% more damage. And these damage numbers may not be entirely accurate, but they're probably quite close. Around 68% more damage is somewhere between a 2 and a 3 link support, which means that this Ascendancy node here on the Servant of Arakaali is essentially attempting to simulate an Arakaali's Fang with support gems in there. Of course, you don't have the agency of which support gems are actually in there, but this, once again, is going to be a nice thing for early mapping, for early leveling. It'll be nice for clear, but it is, once again, something that you may wish to spec out of later on, because you can't really scale it too much. And now we're moving on to the Wildspeaker. That's a Ranger Ascendancy that grants level 20 Summon Spectral Wolf on critical strike. Now we know that the Summon Spectral Wolf skill is actually already in the game. It's already on a unique ring there. That's the level 10 version, and the level 25 version is on a unique dagger. But you'll notice here there's no level 20 version. That's because the level 20 version actually already exists in the game back from Crucible League. You can see right here that trigger level 20 summon Spectral Wolf on critical strike with Cleave or Reave was actually a modifier that you could obtain during Crucible League, which means this skill already exists. Here it is right here, level 20 summon Spectral Wolf. So these wolves have a base duration of 30 seconds. They're triggered, of course, on critical strike. And each wolf will grant you a buff of 6 to 12 added attack physical damage. So with the maximum of 10 wolves that you can get with this skill, you will have up to 60 to 120 added attack physical damage, which is a good amount of flat damage. And once again, this is going to be a really, really nice thing to take early in the campaign. If you can find a way to actually reliably find critical strikes to actually spawn these wolves. The wolves themselves actually deal a lot of damage very early on in the campaign, and through the campaign you're just going to see them swarm enemies and kill them very quickly. But once again, a really nice node to take early on if you can find that critical strike chance. Next up is the Daughter of Oshabi, another Ranger Ascendancy there, which has trigger level 20, create Lesser Shrine when you kill an enemy. And the level 20 Lesser Shrine has been updated there in PoE but the stats appear to be identical. So this is a skill which gets triggered and then it leaves an interactable object on the ground that you need to actually click on to gain a Lesser Shrine buff. The object lasts for 10 seconds and the skill itself has a 20-second cooldown. So it'll only drop one of these objects once every 20 seconds once it's triggered. And upon interacting with that, you'll actually gain a Lesser Shrine buff randomly from this list here. And each of these shrine buffs lasts for 20 seconds and can be scaled with shrine duration. Next up is the Ancestral Commander Ascendancy, which has the Spirit Wheel here, which grants you a bunch of different spirit options. These are the skills that were part of the Trial of the Ancestors League. They actually came on loyalty tattoos in that league, and I speculated in a recent video that these would be changed for the Ancestral Commander, and it appears that they're not changed at all. So the level 20 version does exist there, but it appears to be identical in terms of stats. It has a base duration of 12 seconds. This is the same for all of the spirits, by the way, not just this one, but I'm just using this one as an example. So base duration of 12 seconds, cooldown of 80 seconds, and each of them, of course, provide a buff which has a special mechanic that actually requires you to be able to summon those things. For example, this one is triggered on critical strike against a marked enemy. And I wanted to actually highlight this one because I think this is one of the only ones that will be used, if at all. And that's because the Summoned Spirit of Rakiata has a very specific use case of being able to burst down bosses that do not have any phases. Because this buff causes your action speed to always be at least 110% of base value. And that buff actually scales up there per Tasadio tattoo that you have in your build, which means that you can actually get your minimum action speed up quite high. And then you can use all of that speed to burst a boss down very quickly. That's pretty much the only use case for this spirit, and for that spirit wheel in general. The rest of them are kind of mediocre, so I don't really expect many Ancestral Commanders, if any, to use those spirit skills. Now we're moving on to some of the changes that GGG have made to the Ascendancies in the last couple of days. You may have already seen these, but I'll quickly go over them. So first off, we have the Damnation notable on the Herald Ascendancy, which previously provided the Eternal Damnation buff, which made half of your chaos resistance be applied as elemental damage reduction. And it also carried the downside of Eternal Damnation, which makes it so you cannot gain Endurance, Frenzy, and Power charges. Damnation has been entirely replaced with some new stats. So for each element you've been hit by damage of recently, 20% reduced damage taken of that element, and then 20% of cold, fire, and lightning damage taken is recouped as life. So in my opinion, this is a straight downgrade to the previous setup there. It does mean that you can use charges with this node. However, the previous node provided a very easy way to obtain over 35% elemental damage reduction, especially when combined with the future Nostalgia node there, which made it very easy to cap out your chaos resistance. And there is actually a couple of key differences with Damnation and the previous node there. The main one being that this node does not stack additively with Eternal Damnation. So if you're interested in actually using that now with the new node, it doesn't stack additively in terms of damage reduction. That's because Eternal Damnation provides elemental damage reduction, and this node now provides a damage taken modifier, which is calculated on a different step of the damage taken calculation. In addition to that, Damnation is a conditional defense. You actually need to have been hit by that damage type recently to actually have this buff active in the first place. So if you haven't been hit by a damage type recently, the first time you actually do get hit by that damage type, you will not have this damage reduction. So for example, if you're in a boss fight and you're avoiding their abilities, let's say you're in an Eater or Worlds fight and he uses his beam ability on you and it hits you, the chances are you haven't been hit by lightning damage recently, and therefore that hit is going to do full damage to you. Now there is one saving grace for Damnation, and that is the fact that you can actually use this with a Herald of Thunder auto bomber, because that build likely uses Storm Secret, which deals lightning damage hits to the user every time Herald of Thunder hits an enemy, which means that you can actually use that to always benefit from the 20% reduced lightning damage taken modifier, as it's always going to be up, and it means you can also recoup that damage. But even with that said, a lot of those builds like to also use damage taken as setups, and that may actually interfere with that because of course you'll be reducing the amount of damage that you're actually taking. Moving on to the Harbinger Ascendancy, which was also changed quite significantly. We have this node, which used to be a standalone channeling node, which provided bonuses while you are channeling. That's been completely replaced with new stats, and this notable is actually really good. Gain 20% of maximum mana as extra maximum energy shield, and gain 10% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield. 30% of non-chaos damage taken bypasses energy shield. So that third line there that I just said, the 30% of non-chaos damage taken bypasses energy shield, whilst that may seem like a downside, is actually pretty much going to be an upside for any build that wants to use this, because it allows you to split damage taken between all three resources when you also use Mind Over Matter. That means that part of the damage is going to be immediately bypassing energy shield, and when that damage actually hits life, part of that damage then goes over to mana as well. So if you can find a build where you want to stack both life and mana, this is going to be an extremely powerful notable to take in that setup. The other thing that changed with the Harbinger is that all of the Harbinger skills actually were changed and buffed. Now, the first major change about these is that they actually stack now with the unique items. Previously, they wouldn't have stacked because there was a limit on the amount of Harbingers you could have, and now that limit appears to not exist, at least when combined with these skills. But one of the other things they actually did was they improved the skills that the Harbingers actually use on the players. So for example, this Harbinger of the Arcane skill, it grants Arcane Surge on you, and it also grants another buff which grants you chance to shock and lightning penetration. And the other Harbingers also have other powerful buffs that they actually place on you. And usually they wouldn't have very good uptime, and you'd have to kind of do some things in terms of, self-cast temporal chains and things like this node here to allow those buffs to actually last longer on you. But it may be the case that they actually last longer by default. Now, they may even have full uptime by default. We don't actually know that just yet, and the Datamine hasn't really provided any information on that front, which means we're going to have to wait and see until we're actually in-game and in the league to be able to see exactly how good these Harbinger minions are. Lastly, for those changes that GG have put out on the Ascendancies, they actually changed the Cloak of Flame notable on the Scavenger to go from being specific to hits to actually affect all damage. So now this notable will provide 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage, whereas previously it was 40% of physical hit damage taken as fire damage. Now that means that for the first time ever, as far as I'm aware, you're going to be able to shift all of the physical damage that you take into a different damage type. Previously that was possible, but only for hits. And in this league, and maybe this league only, you're going to be able to actually do that for all physical damage, whether it's damage over time or hits. And you're going to be able to do that by using the Cloak of Flame Ascendancy notable on the Scavenger, combined with the Cloak of Flame item that will provide you with 40% of that stat. And then you'd also use a Dawnbreaker, a max rolled Dawnbreaker, and that will get you up to exactly 100% of physical damage taken as fire damage. And that's not specific for hits, that will also work for all damage over time, including things like bleeding and corrupted blood. Now lastly, in this video, we've got two changes that I believe are actually errors in data mining rather than an actual change that's happening in-game, but I thought I'd mention them anyway, just to be aware that this may actually be a thing when you actually get into the game. So first is the Ancestral Commanders Born Under Fire notable there, which makes nearby enemies convert 50% of their physical damage to fire, Well, the Datamine has flagged this up with 50% of physical damage converted to fire. Now, as I said, I actually think this is a data mining error, and this is just showing the modifier that is applied to those enemies, which is 50% of physical damage converted to fire. But it may be the case that Born Under Fire now converts 50% of the player's damage into fire. We'll have to wait and see if that's the case. The other one, which is very similar to that, is the Puppeteer Ascendancy on the Enervating Presence notable, which makes nearby monsters have at least 20% of their life reserved. This has been flagged up with reserves 20% of life, which again is the modifier that's being applied to those enemies. So I actually think this is once again a data mining error, but it may be the case that this reserves 20% of the player's life, because the reserves life stat there is actually the exact same wording that exists on Midnight Bargain, for example, which says reserves 30% of life. So again, I think it's an error, but it may not be aware of that. And the reason why I think both of those are errors is actually because if we take a look at the Behemoth Ascendancy here, we have the Mental Conditioning notable, which has Power of Purpose there, which is a keystone that grants 80% of maximum mana converted to twice that much armor, but then it has that exact modifier line actually on the notable itself, and that would mean that all of your mana would be converted over to armor, and it would leave you with literally 0 mana, which is not going to be the case. So I believe the exact same thing is happening right here, where it's pulled up one of the modifier values there, and it's actually showing it on the notable where it shouldn't be. For those interested, we also have all of the unique idols here that have been data mined, so I'll leave a link to that below if you want to actually read through all of these. Most of them are just the keystones from the Atlas passive tree, but there's a few changes there, so you can take a look at those if you want to. Good luck with your league start in the Legacy of Phrecia. I hope you have a fun time for the launch. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.